video, we're going to talk briefly about probability. And we're talking about probability and really for two different reasons. And the first is being that as we're talking about the normal curve, we have some information about probability because we have these percentages of if I took a random score out of the normal curve, for instance, I could consider that it's going to be much more likely that I'm going to grab a score that's closer to the middle just because there's more scores there than I would grab a score from the end if they were all jumbled in a bag together, for instance. And so when we can think about that way, and this is kind of going to foreshadow what we'll talk about when we start talking about hypothesis testing, and particularly talking about the normal curve when we talk about the z-test, although this idea will kind of translate with all of our discussion of hypothesis testing in this course. And so when we talk about probability, probability is the expected relative frequency of a particular outcome. And it's the proportion of the number of times something happens relative to the number of times that that thing could have happened. Probability in general, we're going to talk about this as being between 0 and 1. And that's because this corresponds to percentages from 100 to 100, from 0% rather to 100%. And in statistics, we talk about probability as being our p-value, and p stands for probability. Usually this is written as a decimal. So for instance, we can say p is less than 0.05, and that means that there's a less than 5% chance that this thing has occurred. And so again, if I'm looking at my normal curve here, I can see that there's much greater percentage of scores here towards the middle and fewer out towards the ends. If I'm saying that there's a less than 5% chance maybe of me getting this score, then I'm saying that it's out towards one of these tails essentially. In order to find the probability, we basically are going to determine the number of possible successful outcomes, determine the number of all possible outcomes, and we're going to divide the number of possible successful outcomes by the number of all possible outcomes. In this course, we're not going to be doing this a whole bunch, but this is in general the background here of how we're figuring out probability. And so again, if we have a jar that contains 100 jelly beans, if 9 of those jelly beans are green, the probability of picking a green jelly bean is going to be, again, that number of successful outcomes over the number of possible outcomes. And in this case, we would get 9 over 100 or 9%. We can think of this, and again, we're kind of foreshadowing some of the stuff that we'll talk about later with hypothesis testing. But what we're kind of thinking about is if I have an extreme score, if I get one of the scores out here at the very end of this particular distribution that I have here, what is the chance that I got that? Is it likely that this score is even from this distribution? Or did this score maybe come from somewhere else? And that's some of the questions that we'll be asking when we get to hypothesis testing. It's worth introducing this idea now as we're thinking about the normal curve, as we're kind of setting up some of the basis for what we'll talk about when we get to hypothesis testing and the z-score, but we'll return to this idea later. Thank you for watching.